England was in chaos. The monarchy had fallen. A king had been executed by his own people. And in its place, a republic was born. For the first time in history, England was ruled not by a king, but by men. But revolutions do not last forever. In 1660, after years in exile, one man returned to restore the monarchy, a king who had lost everything but never gave up. This was Charles II, the son of a beheaded king, a man who had spent years hiding in forests, disguising himself as a commoner, fleeing across Europe all to reclaim his father's throne. And when he finally did, he ruled not with revenge, but with charm, intelligence, and a determination to never lose his kingdom again. But how did he reclaim England? And how did he survive in a world where kings were no longer safe? To understand the rise of Charles II, we must first understand how everything fell apart. The year was 1642. England was torn apart by civil war. On one side, the royalists, loyal to King Charles I, believing in the divine right of kings. On the other, the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, who saw the king as a tyrant. For years, England was drenched in blood. Families were divided, cities were destroyed, and the nation was on the brink of collapse. Then, in 1649, the unthinkable happened. King Charles I was captured, put on trial for treason, and beheaded in front of his own people. A king executed by his subjects. For the first time in history, England was a republic. The monarchy was abolished, and in its place, Oliver Cromwell took power, ruling as Lord Protector of England. But Charles I had a son, a young man who had been forced to flee for his life, a prince without a kingdom. This was Charles II. At just 19 years old, he watched his father's execution from exile. He knew that at any moment, he could be next. But he refused to accept defeat. He refused to let the monarchy die. For the next 9 years, Charles traveled across Europe, searching for allies, gathering support, and waiting for the moment when he could return. In 1651, he made his first attempt. He landed in Scotland, raised an army, and marched south to reclaim England. But Cromwell was ready. At the Battle of Worcester, Charles was crushed. His army was defeated, his supporters were scattered. He barely escaped with his life. Now, Charles was not just in exile, he was a fugitive. For weeks, he was hunted by Cromwell's men. A price was placed on his head. Every town, every village, every road was filled with soldiers looking for him. To survive, Charles had to become invisible. He disguised himself as a servant. He slept in fields and barns. He hid in the hollow of a great oak tree, the famous royal oak, while Cromwell's soldiers searched beneath him. At any moment, he could have been captured, but somehow he always slipped away. Eventually, he found passage to France. He had lost the battle, but he had survived. And as long as he lived, the monarchy was not truly dead. For the next 9 years, Charles watched from exile as Cromwell ruled England. But Cromwell was not a king. He ruled with military force, banning theaters, shutting down celebrations, and turning England into a strict Puritan state. The people had once fought to overthrow a king, but now they found themselves under the rule of a dictator. And when Cromwell died in 1658, the cracks in his republic began to show. Without his iron grip, England fell into chaos. His son, Richard Cromwell, tried to rule, but he was weak. He had no army, no power, no support. The people had had enough. They wanted a king again. And so, after nearly 2 decades in exile, Charles II received the message he had been waiting for. The time had come to reclaim his throne. The exiled prince was now being called back to England. After nearly 2 decades of war, Puritan rule, and dictatorship, the people had grown tired of their new republic. Oliver Cromwell, the man who had overthrown the monarchy, was dead. His son, Richard Cromwell, had taken his place, but he was weak. He lacked the charisma, the control, and most importantly, the army. He was no military leader, and without the force of his father's rule, England fell into political chaos. Parliament, which had once fought against Charles I to remove the monarchy, was now divided and confused. Without a strong ruler, the government had no direction, and the people had no stability. And in the shadows of this confusion, whispers of restoration began to spread. Old royalists, former supporters of the monarchy, saw an opportunity. They reached out across the sea to the one man who could restore order, Charles II. The invitation came in 1660. Charles, now 30 years old, had spent 9 years waiting for this moment. He had been a fugitive, a wanderer, an exile living in the courts of France, Spain, and the Netherlands. He had begged for money, sought allies, and plotted his return for years. Now, at long last, England wanted him back. But Charles was no fool. He knew that if he was to return, he had to do things differently. His father had ruled with absolute power, believing that kings were chosen by God and should not be questioned. That belief had cost him his head. Charles would not make the same mistake. Before setting foot in England, Charles made a promise to Parliament, the Declaration of Breda. In it, he vowed to rule not as a tyrant, but as a king of compromise. He promised to forgive his enemies, allow religious tolerance, and work alongside Parliament rather than against it. It was exactly what the people wanted to hear. On May 29, 1660, Charles sailed back to England, stepping onto English soil for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The streets of London were filled with cheering crowds, bells rang out across the city, and England had a king once more. The monarchy had been restored. But Charles knew that simply reclaiming the throne was not enough. He had to keep it. And to do that, he had to play the game of politics, navigate dangerous alliances, and ensure that no one would ever take his crown away again. Charles had reclaimed his birthright. But the England he returned to was not the same as before. The scars of the Civil War remained. His enemies were still watching. And not everyone was willing to forgive the son of a fallen king. Charles had returned as king, but England was not the same country it had been before the Civil War. The people welcomed him, but they were divided. Some celebrated the return of the monarchy, eager for stability and tradition. Others, particularly those who had fought against his father, remained suspicious. And then, there were those who had directly signed Charles I's death warrant. To the royalists, these men were traitors responsible for the murder of a king, but Charles had promised forgiveness. Now, he had a choice. Would he seek revenge, or would he prove that he was a different kind of ruler? At first, Charles offered mercy. He kept his word, allowing many of his father's enemies to go free. But not all of them. There were some men whose crimes were too great to ignore those who had played leading roles in the execution of Charles I. A hunt began. The most notorious regicides, the men who had sentenced Charles's father to death, were captured, tried, and executed in brutal fashion. Some were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Others were simply imprisoned. But the message was clear. Charles had forgiven many, but not all. With justice served, Charles turned to his next challenge, governing England. He had sworn to work alongside Parliament, but this was no easy task. England was still recovering from years of Puritan rule. Many laws had been put in place that banned dancing, music, and even Christmas celebrations. Charles, known for his love of entertainment, theater, and luxury, set out to change that. He reopened theaters, allowed festivals to return, and ushered in a new era of culture and celebration. London became a city of fashion, art, and scientific discovery. The Royal Society was founded, bringing together some of the greatest minds of the time, including Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke. But beneath the glamour, Charles was walking a dangerous line. He had seen firsthand what happened to a king who ruled without the support of the people. He knew that he had to be careful, to balance power with diplomacy, authority with charm, and that balance would soon be put to the ultimate test. Because even as England celebrated his return, disaster was just around the corner. The Great Plague, the Great Fire, political conspiracies. Charles II would face trials that no king before him had ever endured, and through it all he would fight not just to rule but to survive. Charles II had restored the monarchy. He had won the love of the people, but ruling England was never going to be easy. For all his charm and diplomacy, Charles was still a king in a country that had once executed its monarch. He had learned from his father's mistakes, would not rule with an iron fist. Instead, he would rule with wit, intelligence, and careful alliances. But no amount of political skill could prepare him for what was coming next. In 1665, England was struck by one of the deadliest plagues in its history. The Great Plague of London spread like wildfire, sweeping through the city with terrifying speed. The streets were filled with the sound of carts collecting bodies. Entire families were wiped out overnight. With no understanding of how the disease spread, people turned to superstition and fear. They blamed everything from bad air to stray animals. Doctors wore eerie, bird-like masks, stuffing them with herbs in the hopes of warding off infection. As the death toll climbed, thousands fled the city, but Charles did not leave. Unlike many nobles who sought safety in the countryside, Charles stayed in London, overseeing efforts to control the outbreak. He ordered mass burials, shut down gatherings, and tried to prevent panic. But nothing worked. By the time the plague had run its course, nearly 100,000 people had died, almost a quarter of London's population. The city was weakened, mourning, struggling to recover. And just when it seemed that things could not get worse, disaster struck again. 1 year after the plague, as London was still reeling from its losses, the city faced a new kind of catastrophe that would reduce it to ashes. The 2nd of September, 1666, the city of London was asleep. It was just past midnight when, in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, a fire broke out. What started as a small kitchen fire quickly grew into an unstoppable inferno. The flames spread through the tightly packed streets, feeding on wooden houses, leaping from rooftop to rooftop. The wind carried embers across the city, igniting new fires in every direction. London was burning. Panic set in. People fled their homes, carrying whatever they could. Some ran to the River Thames, hoping to escape by boat. Others desperately tried to save their belongings, but the fire was too fast. For 4 days, the Great Fire of London raged, consuming everything in its path. Churches, markets, homes, nothing was spared. By the time it was over, 80% of the city was destroyed. But in the midst of this chaos, one man took control. Charles II did not flee. He took to the streets, organizing fire brigades, ordering buildings to be torn down to stop the spread of flames. He worked alongside his people, directing efforts to bring the inferno under control. His leadership in this crisis saved lives. And when the fire finally died, Charles knew that London could not remain in ruins. He made a promise to the people: the city would rise again, stronger than before. Under his guidance, London was rebuilt, wider streets, brick buildings, a city designed to withstand future disasters. But while Charles had proven himself a leader in times of crisis, he was about to face a far greater challenge. Because his real battle was not against plague or fire, but against the enemies lurking in the shadows. Plots, betrayals, and whispers of rebellion. Charles had secured his throne, but there were those who wanted him gone, and soon they would make their move. Charles II had survived exile, war, plague, and fire. He had restored the monarchy, rebuilt London, and won the love of his people. But the greatest threat to his reign was not disaster or disease, it was politics. Because no matter how much England had welcomed him back, there were still those who did not trust him. And soon whispers of betrayal and conspiracy would spread through the kingdom, whispers that could destroy everything he had fought for. The first problem was religion. England was a Protestant nation, but Charles? He had spent years in Catholic France. His mother was Catholic. His brother James, the heir to the throne, was openly Catholic. This created suspicion. Was Charles secretly a Catholic? Would he try to force Catholicism back on England? In 1673, Parliament forced him to sign the Test Act, a law that banned Catholics from holding public office. Charles signed it, but behind the scenes, he was making secret deals with France. In 1670, he had signed the secret Treaty of Dover, a hidden agreement with King Louis XIV of France. In exchange for money, Charles promised to convert to Catholicism at a later time. He kept this deal hidden from Parliament, but the rumors grew. By 1678, a new conspiracy gripped England, the Popish plot. A man named Titus Oates claimed to have uncovered a Catholic plan to assassinate Charles and replace him with his brother James. The public panicked. Anti-Catholic hysteria spread through the country. Dozens of innocent people were arrested and executed, all based on lies. Even members of Charles's own court were accused of plotting against him. Parliament turned against him, demanding that his Catholic brother James be removed from the line of succession. Charles faced a choice to sacrifice his brother to keep his throne, or fight back against Parliament. And this time, Charles did not back down. In 1681, he dissolved Parliament and ruled England alone. He had learned from his father's mistakes would not be controlled. For the last years of his reign, Charles ruled as an absolute monarch. He crushed opposition, secured his power, and ensured that no one would challenge him again. But time was running out. In February 1685, Charles fell gravely ill. On his deathbed, he revealed his final secret. A priest was brought into his chambers. And in his final moments, Charles converted to Catholicism. The Protestant king had died a Catholic. The revelation shocked England. Some saw it as a betrayal, others as proof of the rumors that had surrounded him for years. But one thing was clear: Charles II had played the game of kingship until the very end. And he had won. He had restored the monarchy. He had ruled with charm and strategy, but his death would set the stage for England's next great crisis, the reign of his brother, James II. On the 6th of February 1685, Charles II, the king who had survived exile, war, plague, fire, and political betrayal, took his final breath. His death was sudden and mysterious. Some believed it was natural, the result of years of indulgence, too much wine, too many late nights, too much stress from ruling a divided kingdom. Others whispered poison, a secret assassination. But regardless of how he died, his reign had left an undeniable mark on history. For nearly 25 years, Charles II had ruled England, not as a tyrant, but as a survivor. He had watched his father beheaded, lived as a fugitive, fought to reclaim his throne, and once he had it, he never let it slip from his grasp. But what kind of king was he? To some, Charles II was the Merry Monarch, a man who brought joy back to England after years of Puritan rule. He reopened theaters, allowed music and celebrations to return, and encouraged a cultural revival that would define his era. He was a lover of the arts, science, and innovation. He personally supported the creation of the Royal Society, an institution that helped shape the scientific revolution, leading to discoveries that changed the world. But to others, Charles was a cunning politician, a man who ruled with charm instead of force, yet never let go of power. Unlike his father, Charles never believed in ruling with absolute authority, but he also never allowed Parliament to control him completely. He walked a fine line between diplomacy and manipulation, always making sure that his throne remained secure. And despite all his political maneuvering, he was loved by his people. But Charles's greatest test was not in politics, it was in religion. He ruled in a time of deep religious tension. England was Protestant, but he was surrounded by Catholic influences. His brother and heir, James, was openly Catholic. Parliament and the people feared that a return to Catholic rule would bring instability and conflict. And yet, Charles never revealed his own true faith. He played the game of politics perfectly, remaining publicly Protestant while secretly aligning with Catholic France. He signed treaties with Louis XIV, accepted secret payments, and never fully committed to either side. Until his deathbed. At the last moment, he converted to Catholicism. This revelation shocked England. Some saw it as proof that he had always been Catholic in secret. Others saw it as a final act of defiance. A man who had lived his entire life balancing power, now making a choice that he had never dared to make in public. But by the time his secret was revealed, it was too late for England to react. Charles was dead, and his Catholic brother, James II, was now king. This moment would change England forever, because within just a few years, James II would lose his throne. The monarchy that Charles had fought so hard to restore would once again be in crisis. And this time, it would lead to one of the most significant moments in British history, the Glorious Revolution. But Charles would not live to see it. Instead, his legacy would live on in the people he ruled, in the city he rebuilt, and in the lessons that future kings would learn from him. He was a man who had survived, a king who had reclaimed his birthright, a ruler who had played the Game of Thrones with intelligence, charm, and strategy. And in the end, he won. But his death was not the end of the Stuart dynasty. It was only the beginning of a new battle for England's future. He had brought back the monarchy, but could it survive after him? His brother's rule would push England to the brink of another revolution, and soon the Stuarts would face their greatest challenge yet. Charles II was gone, but the kingdom he left behind was far from stable. His rule had been one of balance, a careful game of politics where he kept both Parliament and his opponents in check. He had ruled with charm, diplomacy, and strategy, ensuring that no single faction could overpower him. But with his death, that balance was about to collapse. His brother, James II, now sat on the throne. Unlike Charles, James was not a man of compromise. He was openly Catholic, unwavering in his beliefs, and determined to rule with absolute power. Where Charles had been careful, James was reckless. Where Charles had played both sides, James made enemies. Within just 3 years, the very forces that had once welcomed Charles back to England now turned against his brother. Parliament, the Protestant nobility, and even his own allies saw him as a threat. The tension that had simmered under Charles's reign finally boiled over. In 1688, just 3 years after Charles's death, James II was overthrown in what would be known as the Glorious Revolution. He fled to France, and the throne was given to his Protestant daughter, Mary, and her husband, William of Orange. The Stuarts had lost their grip on England, and the monarchy was forever changed. But what of Charles's legacy? Unlike his brother, Charles had ruled wisely. He understood the power of public opinion, the necessity of compromise, and the danger of ruling with an iron fist. He had not clung to absolutism like his father, nor had he alienated his people like his brother. He had brought England back from the chaos of civil war, rebuilt its capital, and restored the monarchy after its darkest period. He was not a conqueror nor a warrior king. He was a survivor, a man who had spent years in exile, hiding, running, waiting for his chance to reclaim what was his. And when that moment came, he took it not with bloodshed, but with diplomacy, not with revenge, but with charm. His reign marked the beginning of a new era. The monarchy he restored would continue, but it would never again be the same. The power of the crown had changed, and future kings and queens would rule with the lessons learned from Charles's time. He had shown that to be a successful monarch, one did not need to be feared, but respected. Not ruthless, but clever. Even today, Charles II remains one of the most fascinating figures in British history, a king who danced between danger and power, between exile and the throne. A man who played the game of monarchy better than most, and in the end, despite every challenge, every betrayal, and every obstacle in his path, he had won. But history moves forward. The Stuarts would continue to rule, but their days were numbered, and soon England would face another transformation, one that would change the monarchy forever. The world that Charles had restored was about to enter a new age, one where kings and queens would no longer hold absolute power. And the question remains, if Charles had lived longer, could he have prevented what was to come, or was the fall of his dynasty inevitable? Charles II had secured his throne, rebuilt his kingdom, and restored the monarchy. But his death marked the beginning of a new chapter for England, filled with uncertainty, conflict, and a transformation that would reshape the monarchy forever. His reign had been one of survival, of calculated diplomacy, and of a constant balancing act between power and politics. But with him gone, that balance was shattered. His brother James II, now king, lacked the political finesse and adaptability that had defined Charles's rule. Where Charles had ruled with charm and compromise, James ruled with force and conviction, making enemies at every turn. James's open Catholicism alienated the Protestant nobility. His belief in absolute monarchy clashed with Parliament, which had already grown wary of unchecked royal power. The carefully maintained peace of Charles's reign crumbled, and soon England faced another crisis. In 1688, just 3 years after Charles's death, James was overthrown in the Glorious Revolution. The very monarchy that Charles had fought so hard to restore was once again in danger. But this time, there would be no execution, no civil war. James fled to France, and the throne was handed to his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband, William of Orange. It was a peaceful coup, but its consequences were massive. The Glorious Revolution marked the end of absolute monarchy in England. From that moment on, kings and queens would rule, not by divine right alone, but by the will of Parliament. The monarchy would continue, but it would never again have the kind of power it once held. So what then is Charles II's legacy? Some see him as the last true king of England's old monarchy, a ruler who understood how to wield power without losing himself to tyranny. Others see him as a king of indulgence, a man who enjoyed pleasure and entertainment more than governance. But perhaps his greatest legacy is that he kept the monarchy alive when it was at its most vulnerable. Had he failed, had he ruled like his father or his brother, England may never have had a monarchy at all. He proved that kings could be more than warriors, that power could be held through diplomacy as well as force. He was a ruler who did not take vengeance, but instead built alliances, who did not demand obedience, but earned loyalty. He had played the game of monarchy and won, and in doing so, he ensured that England's throne would endure, even as the world around it changed. But history is never simple. The monarchy would continue to evolve, and future rulers would face new battles not on the field, but in Parliament, in law, and in the ever-changing will of the people. The age of absolute kings was fading. And as history moved forward, one question remained. If Charles had lived longer, could he have shaped the monarchy into something stronger, something more lasting? Or was the fall of his dynasty and the rise of constitutional rule inevitable from the moment his father lost his head? Charles II had spent his entire life fighting to reclaim and secure his throne. From the moment his father was executed, he had been a king in exile, hunted across Europe, living on the edge of survival. But unlike so many deposed rulers before him, he had done what few thought possible. He had returned to power without war, without conquest, but through politics, patience, and persuasion. And yet, despite all his victories, despite all the challenges he had overcome, the monarchy he restored was never the same again. The glorious revolution of 1688, just 3 years after his death, proved that the old ways of ruling absolute power, unchecked authority, divine right were gone. The monarchy would survive, but it would now be a constitutional monarchy, where Parliament held the true power, where no king could rule alone. Would Charles have been able to prevent this? If he had lived longer, could he have strengthened his family's hold on the throne? Or was the shift toward parliamentary rule inevitable from the moment his father lost his head? What is clear is that Charles II's reign was a turning point in British history. He proved that a king could be both a leader and a survivor, that power could be maintained through diplomacy as much as through force. His ability to read the political climate, to compromise when necessary, and to charm even his enemies kept him in power when so many others had fallen. His rule saw the rebirth of England's cultural and scientific life. He was a patron of the arts, a supporter of the Royal Society, and a man who understood the value of progress as much as tradition. And yet, despite his success, he left behind a fragile legacy. By converting to Catholicism on his deathbed, he left England in a state of uncertainty, paving the way for the crisis that would follow under his brother James II. He restored the monarchy, but he could not guarantee its future. Even so, his impact on history is undeniable. For centuries, historians have debated his reign. Was he a great king who saved the monarchy, or simply a lucky opportunist who returned at the right moment? Was he a brilliant politician who understood how to keep power, or a man who let his kingdom slip toward another revolution? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that his reign was neither one nor the other, it was both. He was a ruler who navigated one of the most dangerous periods in England's history and emerged victorious. A man who brought stability where there had been chaos, entertainment where there had been restriction, and diplomacy where there had been war. And so, more than 300 years later, Charles II remains one of Britain's most fascinating monarchs, a king who lived through exile, war, betrayal, and disaster, and yet still managed to die on his throne. He had played the game of kingship and, for all its dangers, for all its challenges, had won. But in the end, the monarchy he fought to restore would never be the same again. The world was changing. And soon, England's rulers would learn that kings and queens could no longer simply take power, they would have to earn it. Charles II had ruled with wit, charm, and political savvy, but even he could not stop the tides of history. He had restored the monarchy, but the world had changed around him. The absolute power his father once wielded was gone, and though he had skillfully maintained control, the question of who truly ruled England, the king or Parliament, was far from settled. His death marked the beginning of an era in which monarchs would no longer be unquestioned rulers, but instead figureheads bound by the growing power of Parliament. His own brother, James II, would soon find this out the hard way. When James took the throne, he lacked the political finesse and adaptability that had made Charles successful. Where Charles had been careful, James was stubborn and reckless. Where Charles had balanced diplomacy with power, James tried to enforce his rule with force and absolutism. The result? Within 3 years of Charles's death, James was overthrown in the glorious revolution, a bloodless coup that saw William of Orange and Mary take the throne. England had chosen its rulers, and, with that choice, it became clear. The days of monarchs ruling by divine right alone were over. And yet, despite all of this, Charles II's legacy endured. He was remembered as the king who had brought back joy to England, who had steered the country through some of its darkest times and ensured that the monarchy survived one of its greatest crises. He was not a warrior king, nor a tyrant, nor a ruler who forced his will upon the people. Instead, he was a king who knew how to rule without breaking his kingdom apart. His reign had been filled with scandal, secret dealings, and moments of near disaster. But through it all, he remained a survivor. He had outlived those who had tried to kill his father. He had navigated the treacherous waters of politics and betrayal. He had ruled in an age where kings were no longer invincible, and he had won. His rule may not have prevented the changes that came after him, but without him, the monarchy itself may not have survived at all. And so, history remembers Charles II not just as a king, but as a ruler who mastered the art of survival. He was a monarch who understood the power of charm, the importance of compromise, and the necessity of playing the long game. His throne was never truly secure. His kingdom was never truly at peace. But in the face of chaos, He did what he had always done, he endured. And in the end, that may have been his greatest victory of all. But history does not stop for any ruler. The Stuarts would soon face their greatest challenge yet. The throne Charles had fought to reclaim would once again be tested. The question was no longer whether England would have a king, but rather how much power that king would be allowed to have. And that battle was just beginning.